Hey, AP Psych, this is Mr. Zortman, bringing you your second online lecture. Hope everybody's doing okay. Today is going to be much shorter than the disorders chapter. We only have two sets of slides. They're both fairly short. The first one's longer than the second one. Um, Once again, if you need to get up and go to the restroom, you may. I know some of your hands are up already asking to go to the restroom. You can stop this at any time and come back to it. One of the benefits of YouTube, right? All right, so here we go. We're looking at psychological therapies first. And so, of course, the first type of psychological therapy we'll talk about is psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is an interaction between a therapist and somebody suffering from psychological difficulties. This does not necessarily have to be a disorder, it can just be a problem that they're having, but psychotherapy is usually based in the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic as well as the humanistic fields. So that's psychotherapy. So, how do actual psychologists and psychiatrists out in the real world actually work? They work by something we call an eclectic approach. Eclectic's just a general um, English term. It means that you like a lot of different things. So the most popular form of therapy is a smorgasbord, which is what you see in front of you. That's a German term for a buffet, basically, where there are therapists. The therapist combines techniques from all the different schools of psychology. So we're going to break them down real quick. Psychoanalysis. Freud's therapy. Freud uses free association. He used to use hypnosis and dream interpretation. We've already talked about why hypnosis and dream interpretation are not as useful nowadays. To gain insight into the client's unconscious. Remember, they're looking for something in the past, some trauma that you had that is causing your current problems. The psychoanalytic methods. So, this is the same thing. Psychotherapists use their techniques to overcome the resistances by the client. They say that the subconscious is working against them, and so they use things like projective tests, free association, to kind of trick your subconscious into giving up its secrets. All right. One of the things that can happen in psychoanalysis and some other psychotherapies as well is transference. The patient transfers uh, to the analyst, so the person that they're seeing, the emotions linked with other relationships. So if you talk about your relationship with, like the cartoon saying, your mother a lot, you might start to view your therapist in that kind of role. All right, humanistic. We talked about this. The same chapter we talked about psychoanalytic. Focuses on people's potential for self fulfillment, also called self actualization by Maslow. So it focuses on the present and the future, but not the past. And it's going to focus on what you're thinking now, not your unconscious thoughts or your subconscious or things in the past, like you would talk about for the psychoanalytics. Um, yeah, so they want you to take responsibility for your actions and not blame your childhood anxieties. It would be a criticism that humanists would have of psychoanalytics. So, most widely used humanistic technique is called the client centered therapy, developed by Carl Rogers. We've talked about him a couple of times. Therapists should use genuineness, acceptance, and empathy to show unconditional positive regard toward their clients. So these words here are genuineness, acceptance, and empathy. We talked about back in the personality chapter, and unconditional positive regard we've talked about a couple of times, but that's just saying you've got to take the client where they're at and try and make progress. You can't wish they were a different way. So one of the techniques they use is called active listening. So basically, you're listening to what somebody says. So the technique goes like this. They say something to you, you reword it, repeat it back to them, and then if you still don't understand what they're saying, you make clarifying questions. Um, this basically allows people to work through stuff on their own because you're just being a sounding board for them, basically. All right, so behavioral therapies. Sorry about the stutter there. Uh, therapies that apply learning principles to the elimination of unwanted behaviors. So, to a behaviorist, the behavior is the problem. So, we've got to change the behavior, not necessarily the underlying problem with your past or with your present. So they're going to use behavioral therapies. Remember the behaviorism chapter? They're going to use classical or operant conditioning to try and get people to behave in a way that is more acceptable. So, how does that work? A lot of times they use classical conditioning, sometimes they use operant conditioning. One of the terms that we need to know about this is called counter conditioning. Behavioral therapy that applies conditions, uh, new responses to stimuli that trigger unwanted behavior. So basically, um, if you're doing something that's unwanted, they're going to condition you by pairing the event with another thing in your brain over and over again until your brain goes to the new thing and not the old thing. So there's two types of counter conditioning. There's systematic desensitization. So this is a type of counter conditioning that associates pleasant, relaxing states with gradually increasing anxiety triggering stimulus. So systematic desensitization, you're going to step it up. You're going to say, okay, if I had a fear of older women, right? Um, what would I do in systematic desensitization? So I would get them in a pleasant, relaxed state so that they are, feeling calm, feeling in control. And then I would say, okay, now we're going to work on this. And I would let them know what's going on. And I might at first just start bringing out pictures. Um, then after a while, maybe have them talk to some older people on FaceTime or something like that, and then eventually go to a nursing home. So it's a step up process with systematic desensitization. Um, so we got progressive relaxation, exposure therapy, and flooding. So progressive relaxation is what we're talking about with systematic desensitization. Exposure therapy is the end step of desensitization, where you actually expose them to something. Flooding is kind of the opposite. Flooding is you're just going to throw them into the deep end. So you might not even tell them that you are going to be working on that phobia today. You might just show up at a nursing home and say, I booked you for 4 hours. You have to do it. So this works for some people, not other people. All right. So virtual technology and exposure therapy. So this is something that we're still working on, obviously, but virtual technology and exposure therapy can make people feel more in control and more safe if they don't know if they do know that it's not real. All right, and aversive conditioning. So Aversive conditioning is another type of counter conditioning that associates an unpleasant state with an unwanted behavior. So, how would putting fecal matter, poop, on the fingernails of a nail biter affect their behavior? If it stops them from doing the behavior, then it's successful aversive conditioning. Um, Here's a version of that that is used fairly frequently. Aversive conditioning is used a lot in the treatment of alcoholism because people drink and drive. They can sometimes get prescribed this. Um, if it's prescribed by a judge, it often doesn't work in the long term, but in the short term, it does. So there's the unconditioned stimulus is that I have a drug that whenever you drink alcohol, it's going to cause you to be nauseous. All right. So the drug creates the nausea, but it only creates the nausea whenever you are drinking. So that then you're going to pair the alcohol with the drug and you're going to be nauseous. So then at the end, obviously, just the alcohol, even if they don't pair it with the drug, does still make some people nauseous. So if you ever had some food, some bad food that you threw up, remember we talked about the Garcia effect at one time. Um, if you had some bad food that made you throw up, you probably won't like that food in the future. So this might only be with one particular brand of alcohol, whatever brand they happen to be drinking whenever this happened, but it does happen. All right. So, what are some ways you can change the behaviors of your friends with aversive conditioning? Right? If somebody in your friends group is a big attention seeker, they want attention all the time, then you can adversively condition them by ignoring them. So they're doing something you don't like, they're making an off-color joke or saying something that they really shouldn't be. Just ignoring them might adversively condition them to not do that anymore. And then whenever they do say something that is funny or is okay, then you pay extra attention to them, would be the flip side. So operant conditioning. So we talked about classical conditioning. Now we're going to look at operant conditioning. So a token economy. Token economies are, we give you rewards for desired behavior, right? You are in a token economy right now. You go to high school, we give you grades, right? I'm not actually giving you anything of monetary value unless you parlay it into a scholarship. But I give you a token. That token will sometimes incentivize you to do the desired behavior. Sometimes, of course, it won't. So a patient exchanges a token of some sort earned for exhibiting the desired behavior for various privileges or treats, right? Extra hour at bedtime, candy, things like that, right? All right, so cognitive therapy. Cognitive therapy, as you can see, is a big chunk of the pie. The reason that cognitive therapy is such a big chunk of the pie is that cognitive goes with everything. So psychoanalysts use cognitive therapy, humanists use cognitive therapy, family therapists use cognitive therapy, and behavioral therapists use cognitive therapy. As a matter of fact, there's a whole branch called cognitive behavioral therapy. All right, so what are cognitive therapies? This is a therapy that's going to teach somebody um, different ways to look at the world. So they have everybody has assumptions about the world and what's going on in the world. So if you can interrupt that thought pattern, which is much harder, much easier to say than it is to actually do. If you can interrupt their thought pattern, and get them to think of something else or change their emotional reaction, then they are much more likely to respond um, differently than they were previously. So, cognitive therapists try and teach people a new, more constructive way of thinking. Is 300 a good or bad batting average for my baseball people out there? Well, if you're doing T-ball, right, 300 is not a great batting average. But if you're in the major leagues and you're going up against the best pitchers in the world, 300 is a pretty good batting average. So you've got to know what your situation is and adjust to it. All right, so cognitive therapy for a lost job. You lose your job. Your internal belief is that I'm worthless and it's hopeless. So you go to the next job and they say, what are some great features about you? And you say, well, my last employers didn't like me very much, right? That can lead to a cycle where you lose that interview and then you get into a cycle of depression. What a cognitive therapist would say is maybe even if it's not healthy or correct, having a internal belief change can be useful. So you lose a job and they change your thinking to say, my boss is a jerk. I deserve something better than this, right? So now you're going into the interview saying, I deserve better than what I'm getting. I deserve the best company to work for. I'm the best employee. You're more likely to get that job and less likely to wind up in a situation where you have depression. So Aaron Beck and his views of depression. You don't really need to know this name, but he's the guy who came up with this. He said that depressed people look at the world in the same way. They look at it through dark sunglasses, is what he said, which is that they see everything as the worst way it could be. Everything is bad. Uh, everything is awful, right? But he said if you can use cognitive therapy to get them to take those dark sunglasses off, then they can start to see what's actually around them. All right, so cognitive therapy, does it work? So here's a little chart about cognitive therapy, depression scores. Here's the first group, and the second group is blue and pink. So the depression scores, the higher the worse. So they took a group of people and they took them in and they sat in the waiting room. They filled out the depression test, and the first group scored on average 26, 27 points. The second group scored on average 20 to probably 24, 23 points. So we got these two groups of people here. So they're going to cognitively train some of these patients, try and use cognitive therapy to change the way they look at the world. At the end of the time here, they're going to do the same test again. Now the people that were up at 26, 27 are down at 11, 12, whereas those that were at 23, 24 are now down to almost 20. So time does help with depression sometimes, but obviously it's much more severe whenever it's helped. All right, and then a quick word on group and family therapies. Group and family therapies there's two things about them. The first thing is the way they're supposed to be used. So the way they're supposed to be used is you go into a group therapy of people that have similar issues to you, and they're to show you that you're not alone. Other people have these problems too, which can be useful in trying to help people out. Family therapies or a family therapist is looking at the family as a whole and not a part. And so they say we got to treat everybody at once. Everybody's got to put in the work or the family cannot get better. Now, the way that it works in the real world and shouldn't is a lot of times group therapies is used as a cost cutting measure. So they don't have enough money. Their insurance doesn't want to pay for a session. So they just cram a bunch of people that have different problems together and hope that the counselor can help them, which often leads to a situation where nobody gets helped. All right, so that was the first set. Don't mind all my open windows here. Biomedical therapies. All right, so biomedical therapies. Now we're going to talk about the drugs. We've already talked about them to death, but we're going to go over them real quick. Just some terms from this chapter that might not be in other chapters. So therapies aimed at altering the body's chemistry. So now we're not talking about talk therapy. We're talking about actually changing the meat brain, right? So psychopharmacology, $5 word that just means drugs that change your brain. Psycho, your brain, pharma, your drugs, and ecology, the study of. So the study of effects on the mind and behavior. All right, so drugs and hospitalization. This one is kind of a um, kind of an iffy chart, but I put it in here just the same. States and counties, mental hospitals, residents in thousands. So in 1900, we had 150,000 people in mental hospitals. Moving all the way up until 1960 would be our height, where we were at 550,000. So what they're saying here is that uh, first wave antipsychotic drugs came out in about 1955, and they're saying here that because of the antipsychotic drugs, uh, the uh, the infirmaries kind of emptied out. That's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that we started to criminalize mental illness. And so we started to take them out of the mental institutions and either put them on the street or put them in jail. So, not exactly great news, but some of this decline is due to better drugs. Some of it is due to policies. Excuse me for 1 second. Allergies, not corona. All right. So, emptying of mental hospitals, where do they empty to, right? They empty to the streets. If they're making too much trouble on the streets, then they'll pick them up and put them in prison. So, testing of a new drug. We've talked about this a little bit, and we're going to come back to it again whenever we review chapter 1. But when a new drug is released, there's always too much enthusiasm. People hear something about a new drug and they say, oh, that's going to solve everything. You hear something about that in the news right now, right? Whereas people have heard stories of a drug working, and so they say, oh, this is a game changer, right? I won't name names as to who would say something like that, but those of you who watch the news know. All right, so in order to test the new drugs, we got to use double-blind procedures to combat the placebo and experimental effects. So if you take somebody off the street and you say, I have a new drug to help you out with this problem, and you give them a Skittle, sometimes they will say, oh, I'm feeling much better, because they think that they should be feeling better, and so they're going to report that they feel better. That's what this word right here is, this placebo. Placebos are fake drugs used to weed out this problem. So if I have an antidepressant drug that I'm trying to bring to market, what I need to do is I need to get two groups of people. One group of people I'm going to give a placebo to, I'm going to give Skittles to. I'm going to take their depression score. I'm going to give them a placebo. Then I'm going to take the depression score of the second one, and I am going to give them the drugs. So at the end of the process, when I take their depression scores again, if both groups are 15% higher, which is a very common outcome, both groups are, say they're 15% less depressed, then my drug doesn't do anything. But if one group is 50% less depressed and the other group is 15% less depressed, then maybe I'm onto something, right? So we've talked about these. A lot of you guys did projects on these for semester. We got antipsychotic drugs. Antipsychotic drugs are to treat psychosis and other mental and emotional conditions. Hearing things that aren't there, seeing things that aren't there. These drugs begin to help schizophrenics with both their positive and their negative symptoms. And that's from the last chapter when we talked about schizophrenia. These drugs, one of the older, more popular ones called Thorazine, often have powerful side effects. You don't want to give these to people that don't have psychosis. Anti-anxiety drugs, including Valium, Librium, Xanax, they depress the nervous system and calm you down. Unfortunately, anti-anxiety drugs have a tendency to be highly abused because if there's a magical pill that can make you chill, then people want to take it, even if there are side effects. And most of these do have side effects, including short-term memory loss and disrupting the brain in the long term. So do anti-anxiety drugs really solve the problem? No. They are a stopgap. So if you're having a panic attack and you can't breathe, and they hit you with Ativan, which is an anti-anxiety drug, to calm you down so that you can start breathing again, that's what anti-anxiety drugs are really made for. They're not made to be taken every day. Antidepressants lift you up out of depression. Most of them increase the neurotransmitters norepinephrine, and you might want to write or add to this, or serotonin. So there are 4 or 5 different classifications of antidepressants, and basically your psychiatrist will try different ones until you find the cocktail that works for you. But they either try and boost serotonin production, decrease serotonin rejection, or they add norepinephrine, are the main ways that antidepressants work. So Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, like I was saying, they work by blocking serotonin reuptake. And so remember, the neuron is going to fire. It's going to send the serotonin out into the synaptic cleft. Some of it is going to hit the receptors, which may cause the next neurotransmitter to fire. So after that, shortly thereafter, these neurotransmitters are going to be retaken into the neurons so that they can fire again. What a SSRI like Prozac does is it gets in there into the spaces where the reuptake occurs and prevents the reuptake from occurring. So what happens is this serotonin's out here and it is going to bind with the site and then it will try and go back up, but it won't find anything, so it'll float around a little bit and then maybe bind with this site, try and go back up here, can't, bind with this site. So it's making the serotonin more active in the system. It's not giving you more serotonin, it's just making the serotonin you have more active. All right, electroconvulsive therapy. This person looks like they are hurting, but they're not. It's a biomedical therapy for severely depressed patients in which electrical current is sent through the brain of an anesthetized patient. So, back in the old days, they used to actually do this while people were awake, and that was bad. They also used to do it for all kinds of mental illnesses. Um, Basically, what they found was that it was more of a behavioral therapy uh, than a biological therapy. In that some people just changed their behavior because they didn't want to be shocked anymore. Um, but electroconvulsive therapy is trying to get your brain to change the way that it fires. So what they do nowadays is they still have to tie you down because you're going to convulse. That's the electroconvulsive. You're going to shake, right? Whenever you get hit by the electricity, just because the electricity is making your neurons fire. Um, but then they're going to hit you with insulin to the point where you can't feel anything. You're usually unconscious. And then they're going to put these pads on and run a current through your brain. This is going to make you convulse. You are going to look like you're having a seizure, and then they will turn it off. This is used for severely depressed patients that nothing else is working for. It's seldom used nowadays. And then psychosurgery. Oh, gave away the big reveal. Surgery that removes or destroys brain tissue in an effort to change behavior. So uh, this is not brain surgery as we normally think of it, which is usually to remove a bad part of the brain or a tumor or something of that nature. Um, This surgery is trying to change the brain so that your behavior changes. So in the 1930s, this guy right here, not exactly sure how to pronounce it, developed the frontal lobotomy. So basically, they're going to take a instrument, they're going to put it either through the eye socket or later through the nasal cavity, and they're going to try and disconnect your frontal lobe and the emotional control centers of your brain from the midbrain. So you would still have your midbrain, you'd still have your hindbrain, but your cerebral cortex and all the functions that it does, you don't have anymore. So some people would argue that you are not you anymore. This used to be done not often, but much more often than it's done currently. As a matter of fact, wealthy men used to sometimes have it done on their daughters whenever they were being too mouthy. So, yeah, not a good thing. But the frontal lobe is disconnected from the midbrain, and sometimes they can feed themselves, sometimes they can dress themselves, but that's usually about it. All right, so here is an old-timey frontal lobotomy picture where they are having reporters come in and report on how it's done. Obviously, this would not be surgically well done today. Obviously, these guys have no sleeves on their coats. They've just got a nurse holding them down. They're not restrained in any other way. Bunch of reporters in there, so obviously it's not a sterile room. And what he's going to do is he's going to put this little device in there through the nasal cavity, give it a couple taps, and try and disconnect the frontal lobe from the rest of the brain. Okay, guys, so that is the chapter. Told you it was going to be shorter than the last one. We are going to, on Monday, I'm going to push out the critical writing, the very last critical writing of the course for chapter 17, social. And then on Wednesday, we'll go ahead and Discord it up. We can go over it, and then I will put out the next video. After we finish the book, I'm going to go back and hit the highlights of the previous books. So stick with me, guys. You've been doing great. Those of you who've been watching these and coming along for the ride. Go ahead and, for the extra credit on this one, go ahead and put the word Mustangs in the comments. And thank you so much. Have a great night and stay safe. Sorry. I'll be here in a second. What do YouTubers say? Smash the like button and hit the bell and subscribe and all that stuff. Haha, here we go. Bye, guys.